Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Harkness. I'm the programming manager at the Portland Public Library, and we're delighted to be hosting this literary lunch in partnership with Maine Inside Out, an organization here in Maine which activates individuals and communities to imagine and embody freedom through art, advocacy, support, and transformative justice. Their work is led by formerly incarcerated people with a mission to build a world where everyone matters and belongs. In conversation today are Ravi Shankar, who will be talking about his new book, Correctional, with Shreerekha Subramanian. Correctional is a bold and complex self-portrait and portrait of America that challenges us to rethink our complicity in the criminal justice system and mental health policies that perpetuate inequality and harm. I will introduce the authors in just a minute. And then Bruce King from Maine Inside Out will start us off with a welcome and a little bit about their work in our state. Ravi Shankar is an award-winning author and editor of more than 15 books and chapbooks of poetry. He's the founder of Drunken Boat, one of the world's oldest electronic journals of the arts, and has been featured in the New York Times and on BBC, NPR, and the PBS NewsHour. He lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Shreerekha Subramanian is a professor of humanities at the University of Houston Clear Lake. She was the first recipient of the Maryland Music Professorship in Women's Studies, established at her university in 2008. She published the monograph Women Writing Violence, the novel and radical feminist imaginaries. She works on feminist and carceral texts from South Asian, African, and diasporic traditions. So Bruce, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you everyone for being here.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having myself and making Maine Inside Out a part of this presentation. It's absolutely apropos. As was stated, Maine Inside Out is an organization that is working to build a world where everyone matters and belongs. And so we use the mediums of art that can be acting, spoken word, and any kind of engagement, but really it's a means by which we engage young people. So system impacted folks, our ages really, we started in Long Creek, so we started with juvenile detention, but we have all ages at this point. We work with, ages pretty much 12 all the way up to 30 something. If somebody's a part of our community, they stay a part of our community. And that's really part of what we're trying to build with Maine Inside Out. A big focus of what we're trying to do is really center the stories of incarcerated people. And so it's so apropos that we're a part of this discussion that we get to show up here, because I've gotten a chance to delve into Ravi's work and really see the way that he's utilized his own incredible spoken word to articulate his experiences, but also to center the other individuals that he met throughout his stint, I'll say, as we call it. And so it's really about, reoriented narratives in a way that can create dialogue and create community. That's what we're trying to do at Maine Inside Out. So we're really hoping that this will encourage that sort of dialogue with individuals. And we're really looking forward to when the book is widely available. We're really on bated breath. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of a mouthful. I know I threw a lot at you there, but I'm looking forward to hearing this conversation and how it plays out. And thank you so much. It's great to be a part of this arts community with this greater mission. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Wow, this is just incredible work that you are doing in Maine. And I'm going to reach out to you after, because I want to connect you with some of my the work that's going on in Houston with some of my formerly incarcerated students, and a nonprofit that one of them is running. His name is Johnny Ward. So I'm going to certainly connect with you, Bruce.
That would be incredible. Thank you so much. Yeah,
absolutely. So I am so excited to be here. I know people are exhausted by Zoom, but I am while I am fatigued with Zoom, but at the same time, I really appreciate the opportunity, because I am really far from all of you. I'm in Houston, Texas. So without Zoom, I would not have been able to participate and speak to Ravi, Dr. Ravi Shankar today. So this is a real honor and privilege for me to be with all of you, in the good state of Maine from the state of Texas. So Ravi, I would like to invite you to read a little bit from your beautiful memoir, and then I'll follow up.
Okay, sure. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm actually in Providence here, the home of the Wampanoag and Narragansett people originally. And I will just, I will read and then we can start discussing. And so I won't even contextualize the book. I'll read you just the end of one chapter and then the very end of the book, which I have been doing a lot of readings and I've shared different portions. And this is one I haven't yet shared. And so this is the end of a chapter called Nomenclature. Looking reverentially and bitterly at the trajectory of Ravi Shankar, who, of course, the sitar player, this is what this chapter is about, his life and work as I lay prostrate on my bunk before count, I see a viable model of how to be an artist in the world, never settling, but always pushing the imagination forward. Pandit Shankar, my namesake and burden, the man who inadvertently made me feel second best, a replica of myself, nonetheless represents a perfect fusion between the old and the new, between the staunch classicist and the progressive experimenter. His roving, unbounded, insatiable, and transnational creative curiosity, steeped in ritual and discipline, but pointed outwards towards play, is a position that I aspire towards every time I sit down to write, even in jail, surrounded by men who seem not to know him or his legacy. When he finally passed away on December 12th, 2012, at the age of 92, I wrote a brief elegy for him, Ravi Shankar and Ravi Shankar, in the New York Times, and in so doing, made my final peace with him. I've decided to be glad that I borrowed my name from him, to be allowed to use it for a while before passing it along to the next Ravi Shankar. The chords of my own raga will be fundamentally different from his. They'll be textured with the subjugated and the marginalized, with pride's relationship to shame and compassion, with the illusion and actuality of uniqueness, with the negligible if crucial distance between the most heralded and the most loathed among us, the ones traveling the world as superstars and the ones languishing alone in jail. My own raga will be less about mastery and more about error, less about the sound of God and more about learning how to hear my fellow humans. And then I'm going to just skip here to the epilogue right at the end of the book. And then we can talk about the journey that we've taken here. Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire defines humanitarian generosity as being motivated by a dehumanizing sense of paternalism and the egoistic interests of the oppressor. It's the reason why there are so many college courses on Marxism, racism, and the abolition of the prison industrial complex taught by professors who benefit from the very institutions they claim to critique. When Julie teaches classes in homeless shelters, she invites conversation that is inclusive, unafraid, difficult, messy, and courageous. Sometimes she will even invite her students home. And I believe that we have to dare to be just as vulnerable in our discussions about race and gender and class if we want to build a more equitable social order. When a sense of victimization is used as a bludgeon to perpetrate violence on another and thereby gain relevancy, there cannot be true transformation or healing. As every aspect of my life continued to come under attack, for my own recuperation, I felt the need to return to Hartford Correctional 5 years after I'd spent 90 days of my life there. I wanted to breathe in the sweat and moldy cinder block, masked over by industrial cleaner, sit in the visiting room in which Julie had waited for hours to speak to me through plexiglass, nearly being denied the opportunity due to wearing a sleeveless summer dress, perhaps reconnect with some of those men who might still be there. I had kept their pain alive even as I had secured my own freedom and still had their inmate numbers and their nicknames. I suppose I wanted to experience something akin to what veterans of war might feel upon revisiting a village they had occupied years before. But it was not to be. All my letters to the men whose inmate numbers I still had went unanswered. The Connecticut Chief State's Attorney and Commissioner of the Department of Corrections ignored my request to speak to them, and then all correctional facilities went into lockdown due to the outbreak of COVID-19, a disease that first emerged late in 2019 in China and then spread to the rest of the world the following year. The risk of infection and transmission was particularly high in jails because of inferior healthcare, little access to proper hygiene, overcrowding, a general lack of testing, and a flux of bodies going in and out. There's no way that I was going to be able to visit. Faced with the dilemma of wanting to re-enter a carceral space, but being prohibited from doing so, I was forced to confront my own motivations in wanting to return to jail in the first place. Was I an anthropological tourist who had gone through an unfortunate time and wanted to capitalize on these experiences by writing this very book? Certainly, my personal circumstances were very different than most of the men I had encountered while incarcerated. I had come from a life of relative privilege and returned to that life, even if I had constant reminders of what I had been through and how much I had lost. Formerly a tenured professor, now it was difficult to be hired as an adjunct to teach expository writing, even when I had 10 times as many positive evaluations and recommendations to the 2 misdemeanors on my record that show up with every background check. The latter were all that seemed to matter. Julie told me that in the aftermath of my incarceration and the enduring, reverberating public shaming, I had been changed. My shape had changed and was now a round peg, still trying to force my way into a square hole. To lose my tribe was devastating, but it compelled me to connect to real people, such as those working in criminal justice reform. I connected with a gardener in Providence who uses the cultivation of vegetables as one way to teach inmates actual skills that would allow them to become apprentice gardeners upon their release. I ran a writing workshop for a professional chef who teaches culinary techniques to young adults in the Department of Youth Services in Rhode Island. I met a former Florida cop who had risen all the way up the ranks to become a member of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, and who described how over-policing certain communities and the incestuous relationship between some prosecutor's office and police departments has led to a corroding distrust in democracy. Well aware of my own difficulties in finding employment, I made an appointment with the director of a nonprofit that helps prisoners reintegrate into society. What she told me confirmed my worst fears. We're not a forgiving society, Mr. Shankar. The rates of unemployment are over 5 times higher for those who have a criminal record than those who do not. Prisoners are stereotyped on the basis of a conviction. The kinds of jobs that I help them get, the lowest of the low. If I can get someone hired as a dishwasher or a janitor, it's considered a great success. If they can become a skilled laborer, a plumber, or barber, we celebrate it like we've landed a rocket on the moon. The irony, she paused a long time, that these men and women are some of the hardest working, cleverest people I've ever met. And I've been on Capitol Hill and lunched at Harvard. They're sorry for their mistakes and want to contribute to society, but no one wants to give them a second chance. And that's why the rates of recidivism are so high. These men and women want to work when they get out and have a stable family life. But guess what? If they can't pull down a steady paycheck, how the pinch are they supposed to resist the streets? The most transformative thing I did was join And Still We Rise, a Boston-based theater company run by Dev Luthra, a classically trained Shakespearean actor, dedicated to telling the stories of those whose lives have been affected by incarceration. We get together every Thursday online, though I'm told in the past it was on a black box theater where everyone could improv in tableau. Now we put together ensemble theater pieces through video, and even as we generate new material, we practice our blocking, we support one another through a crisis of housing or family difficulty, uplifting one another through art and companionship. It's the kind of community theater group that I would never have dreamed of joining while I was at Columbia, yet I feel somehow more invested and alive with them than ever. While I've been beleaguered and beaten down many times over the past decade, being part of this group reminds me weekly that even in my darkest moments, my privilege has inoculated me to a certain extent from the daily injustices faced by the Black and Latino communities, by women and the poor. Above all, this group reminds me to be humble and to be grateful, a lesson that is never finished, but which takes the work of a lifetime to remember and to enact. Lois, a grandmother and reformed drug addict who falls on stage and screen into character so convincingly that it takes my breath clear down to my beating heart, tells me about her family. I'm a mother of 4 sons, and each one of them has been in and out of jail since they were little. First youth services, then the state penitentiary, then halfway houses. But they are good boys. I raised them to know right from wrong. I had to work 3 jobs to pay the rent when they were growing up, so I wasn't around as much as I wanted to be. Sometimes I blame myself. But then other times I think that's just the price of being Black in America. We didn't ask to be here, but here we are. I guess I just feel blessed that they're still alive. In December 2020, in a year that saw the death of George Floyd, Rashard Brooks, Daniel Prude, and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police, a crane lifted a nearly 3,000-pound bronze statue from its granite pedestal, not far from where I live in Boston's Park Square, where it had stood since 1879. The Emancipation Group Memorial, itself a replica of Washington, D.C., statue depicting a godlike, fully attired Abraham Lincoln standing over a kneeling, nearly naked, still shackled Black man. The man is, according to historian Kirk Savage, the very archetype of slavery. He is stripped literally and figuratively, bereft of personal agency, social position, and accoutrements of culture. Frozen forever in this unfortunate juxtaposition, the monument is not really about emancipation, but about its opposite, domination. If a better visual embodiment of white savior complex has ever been crafted, I don't know what it could be. Moreover, as cited in the Washington Post, of the more than 5,000 public statues depicting historical figures in public squares and parks throughout the US, less than 400 of these monuments are of women. We don't have to look that hard to see how racism and sexism color our governmental institutions and permeate our consciousness. Spearheaded by Boston artist Tory Bullock, the Boston Art Commission decided in 2020 finally to take down the statue, giving it the same fate as other Confederate and colonialist monuments around the country. Statues, unfortunately, are easier to move than minds. All it takes is a crane to hoist an offensive reminder of our history onto the back of a flatbed truck to be buried in some official depot's basement. But the reverberation of the colonial mentality continues in the inner workings of everyday life and stays buried within our institutions. Just by making a statue disappear or by entombing an entire class of people in prison will never heal the original wound that arises from the fact that nation building has been a brutal, racist, inequitable practice that unjustly shapes the lives of generations of its citizens. For true reparation to happen, we must acknowledge the enduring legacy of injustice by confronting those who've been wronged and ourselves directly, while also doing the policy work behind the scenes to transform policing, adjudication, sentencing, parole, and reintegration. My own life only overlaps briefly with these larger social justice imperatives, though my experiences have made it impossible for me to avert my gaze, while those around me still suffer, and while others around me either intentionally or complicitly help cause that suffering. Those generations who come after us may well look at mass incarceration, social media shaming, the way we regard medieval bishops who, while building exquisite cathedrals, also came up with ingenious ways to torture their fellow human beings. We refuse each other's subjectivity because we're scared of difference. But your pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness doesn't threaten mine, so long as we can agree on the assumption of privilege that puts that goal at an unequal distance for each of us. I began work on this book because I promised the men at Dorm 4, Hartford Correctional, that I would help share their stories. They might never have the chance to get their voice back from the court documents and psychiatric records, but I can use mine to loosen their closed fists and reveal our shared humanity. Those men are all around us. I'm one of them. I've had to reclaim my own voice from the Hartford Current, the blogosphere, from Amma and Appa, from the lies I told myself because I was hurting and did not know how to confront the pain. I knew how to mask it, but never could quite drink or drug or fuck it away. There's so much I wish I could whisper in the ear of that awe-stricken boy lying on his back on a rooftop in Madras, watching the swirl of stars overhead in a delicious moment of respite from the sweltering summer heat. Everything seemed imbued with such magical possibility. My cousins and I were separated by oceans, but we were family. You could eat sweet pongal with your hand or cornflakes with a spoon for breakfast. Somehow Pac-Man had reached the shores of India, but not Donkey Kong. It all made such perfect sense. Now I wake up each morning with the intention of perceiving again with such non-judgmental curiosity. Some days when I wrap my arms around my beloved, laughing after getting off the phone with my daughters, our dog sniffing and wagging around our feet, miso soup on the stove and the Japanese maple flaring darkly crimson in the window. Everything seems so tender and possible and alive and intended. I just never imagined that I would have to lose so much to come this close to feeling free again.
That's amazing. If everyone can take a moment to just recognize Dr. Shankar's incredible words. Thank you. Thank you. It's just really powerful for me to listen to your words come to life in your voice, Ravi. I really enjoyed listening, especially the nomenclature, but then this sort of updating that you have done since the writing of the book. It's just beautiful. So you've been, I'll just speak a little before asking my question. It was an honor for me also to be the peer reviewer for the book manuscript. And it was a joy to read this book and to see all that you had experienced and this really brilliant carceral critique that you have arrived at, and the innate humanity that you speak throughout your narrative. So for me, it was really eye-opening to read your narrative. And my own background, I just wanted to share that I'm, just to name names here, that I'm at the University of Houston, Clear Lake, and it's a very special institution, a small institution that's really built for working students, working poor students, started in 1974. But since the start of our university, we've had a program for incarcerated men. So that's been sort of contiguous with the history of the university. And I've had the privilege for the last 14 years of teaching students humanities in the free world and teaching in a men's prison. And that's, I feel like, been really pivotal, important part of my own learning and growing. So it's just really brilliant to read your work and how lyrical and poignant and beautiful you are as a writer, Ravi. So I wanted you to really, I want to sort of go right where the difficult spot that you ended on in terms of thinking about privilege and thinking about marginalization, which you seem to do so well. You torque between those two poles really very deeply. You plumb to the depths of that. So I want you to sort of go into unpacking this model minority myth that many South Asian Americans live with, and how it worked for you through your carceral experience as well. But just to think about privilege and marginalization as you have come to understand it, if you can just burst that open through the model minority myth.
Well, thank you so much, Shreerekha. And I think that must be why I'm wearing red, so you can't see me blushing from your kind words. Yeah, I think indeed, in fact, the marginalization and privilege in some ways were the twin rails of my life, I realized, as I was kind of unpacking my own childhood growing up in Northern Virginia with a loving Tamilian Brahmin family and having this idea of exceptionalism, and then going out to school and being discriminated against by virtue of who I was. And so I think very early on, I had that, but certainly that was amplified when I found myself doing these 90 days. On the one hand, I have benefited from enormous privilege, and Indian Americans are particularly some of the best considered, if you look at financial measures, most successful immigrant populations. But of course, that whole idea masks the populations of Cambodian and Bhutanese, many other Laotian Americans who have a lot of trouble. And in fact, I think that we have to keep in mind that very idea of the model minority myth was invented by a white journalist for Time magazine, and in fact to inject a measure of kind of racial animus and to pit kind of one marginalized group against another, to say, why can't you be more like these Asians who are studious and diligent? And so, I mean, that is, I suppose, what I went through is the greatest horror for certainly, I mean, for my parents, who, I mean, Amma and Appa didn't necessarily want me to write this book, because having survived this difficult time, the normal reaction would be to repress it and to push it aside. But what I realized was that I had benefited immensely from the very systems that were, in fact, keeping some of these men. They shared with me their stories, their dreams, their hardships. And yet, at the same time, as one of the men I met said, if your skin is darker than a grocery bag, you're one of us. And so there was a way, and certainly, and I mean, I mentioned this in the book, after 9/11, also, that there was a way in which I felt like I was being re-racialized in some way. And certainly this very first encounter that I write about, I don't talk about, but a wrongful arrest by the NYPD, where race was certainly an element. And so I think it puts me in an interesting perspective to look at the system from both sides. And I was acutely aware, I mean, compared to many others, my experience is minute. I just have brushed up against the system, and by no means, has it kind of impacted and traumatized my life to the extent it has other people. And yet that brief exposure was enough that I can't unsee what I've seen. And it made me realize some of the real systematic problems that exist in our criminal justice system.
Brilliant. That's great. That's great. Thank you. So I was just thinking about the complications of model minority, as you broke down really well, and how it also broke, it was a way of breaking the collective right after post-civil rights, is to think about the so-called good minorities versus the troublesome minorities. So that's great. And I was wondering how, when you are within serving time within the unit, and how the racial lines get drawn, and you write about that. I was wondering how the model minority myth continues to haunt you within those kind of stratifications. And you also wrote in that moment when you're teaching the LEAP program, where you had a student named Tyrone saying, breaking down the racial code, telling you, well, that's why you're up there teaching and we're down here learning. So I was just wondering if you can just talk a little bit more, process it.
Yes, and I have a friend who has some trouble with the term POC, people of color, because it does bring together, I mean, a Singaporean banker with someone who's born in the inner city. And I mean, we can talk more about that, but I think that the collective voice that term gives, there is something to that. But yes, on the inside, I was certainly, and I would be loath to kind of, I think that term reverse racism is a loaded one. So that's not what I would use exactly, but I was certainly called by a variety of different nicknames, from Abu Dhabi to 7-Eleven to Bin Laden. I was, and there was this sense of my difference. I mean, I was one of the only South Asians, and I should say, this whole experience was very different than what I expected. I wasn't in a little cell. I was in a dorm with 60 other men. And I would say a good 95% of those men were men of color, either African-American, Dominican, Senegalese, or Mexican, Latino. So I was already an anomaly as one of the few South Asians. And I wasn't, I mean, you might have, being given this more famous name anyway, I'm quite immune to jokes about my name. And in fact, getting a nickname was a sign that you were integrated into this community. Everyone had nicknames. And so, kind of, even if it was a demeaning one, I was actually kind of accepted by these men. And it was that, when you read about it theoretically and statistically, some of us have read The New Jim Crow and know about the racial disparity that exists, but then encountering it firsthand is really different, because you realize the generational trauma that mass incarceration has wrought. I mean, some of these men shared their stories. They had parents themselves who had been impacted, and they'd had to grow up with a single parent. And, some of the circumstances, I met someone who had been smoking a joint and gotten arrested. It had a cash bond, not very much. I think it was like $5,000, and you can pay 5% or something to be released, and yet he wasn't able to put it up, and no one on the outside was able to put it up. And he was going to night school, getting a degree in accounting, and he failed out of school. He missed the birth of his first son, and he lost his job. And he had been in there for 3 months waiting for his case to go to trial. It's just been continued over and over. And these are kind of very typical stories that I would encounter. And that, I think, was part of what kind of really made me really want to scrutinize what is really happening. How are we spending our taxpayer money? And is the system that we have implemented working for any of us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is again back to a very, very basic question, which I know you have answered in multiple venues. And I feel like we're in a particularly polarized moment all over, locally, globally, nationally, back home in South Asia, India, here. So I'm just, wondering, when you think of your multiple audiences, think of the guys back at the unit where you were. And there are so many good memoirs of those who have survived the carceral experience. Why read your book?
Well, I mean,
I can promise you I'll teach your book. I will be carrying your book to my guys in prison, but I want to know why read your book, and what are you telling Amapa? What are you telling community, your immediate, your larger, various communities?
Well, I think for me, it is evidence that I use this Japanese phrase right in the end of the book, wabi sabi, which, in those of you that might know, in Japanese ceramics, if you put something in the kiln and it cracks, or it's not perfectly symmetrical, they will actually inlay that with gold so as to call attention to the thing that makes it unique and different, and it actually becomes more valuable. And so in some ways, the scar is the source of the beauty. And so that was, for me, really the silver lining in what I experience. Was I encountered these men I never would have encountered, and they shared with me these stories, and I promised them that I would do something with them, and that they said, you have a voice, we don't. And I think that I also hope that the book is appreciated for its literary craft and merits, but that it's not a static artifact, but it's something that compels people to get involved, to agitate for change. And I think this book is both. It's really many stories in one. It's braiding together the stories of my parents' immigration from South India, and my own upbringing as a bicultural American. And it also is the story of mass media. I mean, one of the reasons this book is called Correctional is because I wanted to kind of correct some of those newspaper articles that have been written about me, and I realized the limitations of mass media. There's also a strand about mental health. I mean, many of the men that I met might have had substance abuse issues or mental health problems. They weren't being addressed in prison, in jail. So that is also a strand. And then I also have architecturally these 6 letters that I use throughout the book, and it kind of creates the spine. And each of these letters is named after one of the 6 seasons in India. There is the monsoon season, the season of heavy rain, and the pre-vernal. And, when I was thinking about it, it felt a little bit like the process of assimilation growing up was trying to hammer down these 6 seasons into 4. And pare away, you had to leave parts of yourself in order to really fit in. And so I guess this is a way of kind of making myself whole. And while it is really an introspective book where I'm kind of taking responsibility for a lot of things, I think it is also really a story of America. It's a story of America that I didn't really know, but that exists today. It's, the story of a country where we have these immense amounts of freedom, and yet 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners are here. And when you kind of overlay it with the racial demographic of who is impacted by this system, it becomes a really stark portrait. And so I think sometimes it's you read about this stuff journalistically and in other ways, but I'm hoping that my memoir, because it really is based on my own experience and a voice that a lot of people hopefully can relate to, will allow people to kind of re-see what is really happening. And then I've been told that it's a pretty fun book to read, that it's a page turner, and people have been asking me, when's the movie coming out? So there is that too. Hopefully it's a fun read as well.
It is. It is. It's absolutely a page turner. So we'll have to see if, which industry picks it up. Is it going to be a Hollywood or a Bollywood or alternative cinema? It's great. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the number of men you encountered, and you want to tell, also share their stories, but not obviously speak for them. And you're so deeply aware of the nuance of privilege. I was thinking of Basho, because you talked about Wabi Sabi and Muga. I was thinking of the way when Basho used to write his poetry, his haikus, he was traveling, doing these journeys, and he would get to these really important pilgrimage sites through great troubles and suffering. And he would get to these sites, and then instead of writing exactly about that site, he would write about the poet who journeyed there before, several hundred years before. So he would end up honoring that poet. So there was like a sort of a whole lineage of poetry being honored in his journeys. And I feel like your journey, there is an honoring of the men you encountered within the system as you're telling this story with so much sensitivity. So I'm just so moved by you, Ravi. I'm just really spellbound by your work. I mean, I have this long list of questions, but I just feel like you've been saying such a wonderful, giving such wonderful responses. So I kind of have been going in all these different ways. You used another metaphor that was also very engaging to me. It is when you were in Australia and you met an Indigenous person who taught you about the larrikin, and then you found yourself to be a larrikin. Can you just talk to us? Because in some ways you have a very global vision in terms of all the places you have traveled and the people you have connected to and the marginalized voices that you have woven into your vision.
Yeah. So, after all of this happened, I had a fellowship at the University of Sydney in Australia, and got my doctorate. And that's where I kind of finished working on this book. And there was a lot that I found to like about Australian society. I mean, they have universal health care. It seems like sensible gun control. Everyone's paid a living wage. Yet, similar to here, the Indigenous communities are over-policed, overrepresented in their criminal justice system. Maybe part of the difference is I always like to have a kind of historical viewpoint. And so while America was founded by Puritans, right, Australia was founded by convicts who were kind of kicked out of Britain, and they're the ones, the rum runners and bootleggers, who are the ones who kind of founded it. And there was this Australian term that I encountered of a larrikin, and it maybe roughly, though it has a certain masculine inflection to it, almost someone who is a little bit of a prankster, someone who believes that the rules that have come down from bureaucracy really interfere in the everyday workings of their life. And there's someone who doesn't mind kind of going around a rule or something in order to achieve an end. And someone who is kind of playful, you may say in the UK, taking a piss a little bit, but not intending ever to injure anyone. That term kind of resonated with me, as did a lot of these Australian concepts that I never really thought about, but kind of looking back at the US while I was over there was a really interesting exercise. And then also looking at the US through the eyes of the Australians, who have this very different idea. I mean, many of them think that we must be in danger as we walk on the streets because of the huge numbers of gun violence, right? There are some big differences. I mean, I think Australia is the 10th of the size of the US. And so there are problems in equivalency, but I think in terms of policy, the Green Party is in charge of Melbourne, and they have a truly diverse parliamentary system with a lot of different voices represented. And I found that very interesting as well.
I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned history, and I'm certainly with you on that, because history comes into all that I also teach and the work that I do with the students. So this week is particularly meaningful. We are at Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving. So I'm wondering how you are sort of where you are in your journey with thinking about Thanksgiving and thinking about your own personal narrative. If you wanted to just share some historical insights, because that seems to be all over radio everywhere. There's lots of discussions taking place.
Yes, I mean, I have started, and that's why I wanted to begin this reading by mentioning the Narragansett and the Wampanoag who were here, because in Australia, all public events are usually begun by this welcome to country, where the original stewards of the land are acknowledged. And, while many of my Australian friends thought it was lip service, it didn't really do anything, I, as an American, was always deeply moved and touched when I saw that, because it made me think, can we imagine starting off something acknowledging the slaves on whose backs and labor the wealth of the nation was based? And I was happy to see now there are welcomes of information coming into the U.S. in some way, but I think it's not a time to lie. It's a time of great gratitude, and I'll have family. I hope to connect with other family. I see my cousin here, which is so wonderful. But I think it's also a moment to hold space for those who are marginalized, to pay respect to those who have come before us, and to realize that we are kind of immensely lucky. And if there is a way in which we can be more empathetic, I like to think of Thanksgiving and Day of Mourning together, right? I mean, there is a way in which you are being grateful and you're also lamenting, and maybe hopefully using the holiday as a time to reinvigorate, to recommit yourself to certain causes, and to go forward with more hope and optimism that you can make a positive change in the world.
That's beautiful. That's really wonderful. Thank you. That's very inspiring. And so one more obvious question is food. I'm always curious about food. I love food. And I'm wondering what your, Thanksgiving is looking like, because I'm also thinking about your carceral experience and the struggles around food and nostalgia around food. So,
Yes. And it is actually, it's going to be really challenging. Between my partner and we have 6 children who have vastly different diets. There's a vegan, a couple of vegetarians, a gluten-free, a lactose intolerant. So I think we've asked everyone to bring at least one dish that they will eat. And then, I was thinking myself of contributing curried butternut squash soup with some Granny Smith apples, which I've made before.
Delicious.
Very seasonal, and then get out of the kitchen and let everyone else do what they're going to do, because then I think we'll have a pretty big table and an open table for anyone. My partner, I think, invited someone who she met at the dog park who lost his parents recently, and so it'll be an eclectic group around the table.
Thank you.
Thanks for that conversation, and I'm so happy that we had such a good crowd, because it is an important book, and it's a story that a lot of people can relate to, and that as you said, is not written about, and it's fascinating to hear about it. I, for one, can't wait to get the hard copy and read it myself. So thanks for the conversation, and thanks to Rekha for the really great questions. We did have quite a few questions in the chat, and I'll just go through them one by one. I'm gonna, Bruce from Maine Inside Out asked a question, and I wanted to remind people too that Bruce is here to answer questions too. So if you have a question for Ravi or Rekha or Bruce, just chat them and I'll pitch them. Thanks. There's Bruce. So Bruce, I don't know if you want to say this or I can read it.
Sure. I don't know if it'll translate well, because I got lost a little bit in the thought, but in my time incarcerated, which was about 3.5 years, and it was mostly done in federal time, I was surprised at how many. I mean, there were a lot of people from very disadvantaged rungs of society, but I also found a disproportionate amount of people with fairly advanced degrees in academics specifically. And that did not compute too well for me until I started thinking about components of deviancy, and there were mental health components and things like that. But I guess I'm just wondering if it's just my imagination, or if there's a correlation between between kind of various elements of society. I know when it comes to different regimes that are like more fascist, more obviously fascist regimes, they tend to target the intellectuals first because they're testing the bounds of conformity. And so, and I'm wondering if that feels like a truism to you, that maybe some of that conformity becomes challenged. And I don't know if that's your experience. But I came across quite a few, and I was really surprised.
Well, we talk more about it because, of course, your experience in a federal would be very different than mine at a Hartford Correctional, which is a county jail essentially. And so, no, I don't think I met anyone with a doctorate where I was, but I think it's really, I mean, white collar crime, and one of the things we could always look at is the difference in sentencing between, white collar crime. But I think there possibly is a way in which you want to kind of outwit the system, or I think personally I always had a certain oppositional defiance disorder of some kind, where I wanted to know why I had to do certain things. I was always a questioner. I never could take anything just on the basis of someone saying, well, this is the way it's done and this is the way that you have to do it. I was someone that always had to test the bounds a little bit. And, so I think philosophically made me a little bit of an anarchist growing up. But that would be fascinating to see, Bruce, if you looked at the kind of the professions of who does time. I really couldn't speak to that without any more sociological data myself, but I think it's a fascinating premise.
I think you did. That's kind of what I was getting at. I think it. So thank you. Yeah, I think that testing, natural inclination to test, because I also had it as well, and so I think that it is an experience that some people have, and they're more likely to go outside of the boundaries of what is considered norms, which is not one and the same as what Michelle Alexander and those individuals that are talking about, which is really a direct targeting of certain communities. But free thinkers are naturally challenging the system. So, yeah.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for asking that. Okay, so here's another question to Rekha and Ravi. You both work with residents in correctional facilities. Is there a tension in working with and within the correctional system while being highly critical of that system? How do you manage this tension?
Do you want to take that first, Rekha?
Oh, I would love to. That's a very good question, especially for me, since I teach humanities and I get to sort of at the university, you get to decide what you're teaching and what you are teaching under this guise of humanities. So I'm very much teaching material that critiques carcerality and the prison industrial complex, and they're reading a whole range of intellectuals, from Angela Davis to Michelle Alexander to Isabel Wilkerson, Foucault. They're reading quite a bit, and they ask for more. So generally, the way to manage that tension is that the classroom is a sacral space within the prison. It is located within the prison, but the classroom itself is ours. So it is our classroom. It is run by the faculty, and then the students are very much agents of change and learning in there. So the interference is, it's sort of an issue that remains a bit oblique. So unless you're pressing certain buttons or somehow calling attention to yourself, it feels like generally you can do what you do and continue to do. So when there is a count, such as when the guard comes in to do the count, you stop because the count is going on. You stop talking, then they leave, and then you continue to talk about critiquing the system. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but the students really love that space, and it's a space of privilege within the prison to make your way to the classroom. It's a very rarefied small population that gets to do that. I think the education that's offered within the prisons should be offered to a vastly greater number of individuals. But the few who make it to the university within the penitentiary, they call it Penn State, is very small. It should be larger.
Yeah, I think I would just echo what Rekha was saying. I mean, there's always this negotiation happening between those who teach in prisons and the administrators and the DOC. In correctional, I list some of the book list of banned books, and there was a weekly list, and every week a new thing would be posted about what couldn't be let in, and sometimes it was the most random. I mean, it would be pages 59 to 64 of Men's Health. It would not be. I'd be like, oh, what's in there? You know, yeah. And so there is this intentional suppression of knowledge, and so. When I ran some writing workshops at the York Correctional Institute, a women's prison in Connecticut, and I, like Rekha, would not really talk about what I was teaching. They knew that there was this poetry workshop happening, but then within that space, I would bring them all kinds of literature, and they were really grateful. I know it's been more difficult, apparently, during COVID, because a lot of books and other things have not been getting in. And I am currently teaching at Tufts, which is one of, in Massachusetts, they have actually a prison education program where you can take classes on the inside, get credits, and they can transfer out to local community colleges. And it's very rare and a pretty progressive program. A lot of states. I mean, my own experience was that the arts was being suppressed at Hartford Correctional Center. There used to be a beautiful library, apparently, that had been stripped away under this idea that men were researching their cases and it was costing the state. But I felt like there is this kind of suppression of literacy and education. And these are the very things that you need to reintegrate. Right. I mean, everything I saw was dysregulative and worked against kind of mental health. And I'm a big, firm believer in bibliotherapy, in telling your stories and thereby healing, kind of confronting your own trauma and gaining ownership and possession. And you can only do that if you read and you write. And I totally agree. I mean, a very small amount of people were able to go to school, and it's based on good time, and you can get that privilege revoked, and most of the general population did not have any access, though they had a lot of interest. They wanted something to do, because otherwise you're just sitting around wasting your time.
I can just chime in on that, because it's something that happened with Maine Inside Out. We did initially start our work in a youth detention facility. We no longer do that, and part of it is because I think we were successfully subversive. You know, we are an abolitionist organization, and we didn't make qualms about it, but we were quiet about it initially. Our goal was to eventually see the end of youth prisons in Maine, at least, and hopefully on a larger scale. And during the time when we started, we were looking at 200 some odd youth incarcerated there. Currently, there's about 30, and there are multiple bills that we are looking at that we could see would shut down the facility. So that is, you know, we used to be kind of quiet about it, but the nature is that human beings aren't meant to be confined. And I think when people awaken to that nature, it becomes very confrontational to the structure. So it's something that we've definitely encountered head on.
We had a few more questions from the chat that I don't want to lose time for. So just maybe a couple more. From your conversations with the incarcerated folks, what did you see as top areas that need to be addressed systemically? For example, I recently listened to a talk by Dr. Tricia Rose about structural barriers like housing, education, et cetera, resulting in significantly worse outcomes for marginalized groups.
Yeah, well, there's a long list, and I will say, I was just out in Utah, and I read from the memoir alongside this amazing documentary, Belly of the Beast, which is about forced sterilization of women prisoners in California, which was happening as recently as a decade ago. And so, I mean, I mentioned that because one of the top things I would say is definitely the inferior healthcare on the inside. I mean, it feels like if you are incarcerated, that should be punishment enough. You don't need this another layer of sadistic kind of dysregulation on top of it. But that's, I mean, from kind of mental health, the physical health, those kinds of things. And then the support network that exists on the outside. I mean, a lot of times probation and these halfway houses are a detriment for these men to reintegrate. You have to meet your probation officer every day in the middle of the day. Well, you know, what kind of job can you hold? And they're really, it feels sometimes like the system is kind of incentivized in some way to see people fail, and it's set up for failure. And so that, and yeah, I mean, yes, housing, the organizations, I read a little bit from the epilogue, but that work with helping men reintegrate. I just was talking to this guy, Donnell, and he told me, before I got in, I was a musician, wanted to get my degree. And now that I'm getting out, they're telling me the only thing I can do is work at Dunkin' Donuts, and that I should be happy to have, some low-level retail job. And so I'm not being respected for the complexity of who I am and what I'm able to provide and bring. And so, this phrase that's thrown around, I think is really important: intentional inclusion, right? Being intentionally inclusive. And so kind of realizing that we're stronger as a community and a workforce when we can bring in these different voices, whether they're aged or neurodivergent, and certainly people who have been incarcerated. And when we know 1 in 3 African-American men is going to be arrested at some point in their life, yes, we want to try to make a space, hold a space, and create a space for these men and women to join the workforce and to find community, because that's the thing that will stop reoffending and lower rates of recidivism.
I just wanted to say thank you again to Rekha and Dr. Ravi Shankar and Bruce King. A really interesting conversation. I think we probably all could have stayed on here for another hour or two. There's so much to talk about, and so many things that we don't realize in our daily lives that are being brought up by this book. So thank you for spending time with us, and enjoy your day.
Stay safe.
Bye.